Unraveling the Mind, the 10 Architects of Psychological Collapse. The human mind is the most complex structure in the known universe, a delicate web of electricity and chemistry holding our reality together. Yet, this masterpiece of evolution is terrifyingly fragile. From the shadows of our past to the unseen pressures of modern existence, invisible forces are constantly conspiring to sever the threads of our sanity. We are about to investigate the definitive triggers behind the global mental health crisis, exposing the biological, environmental, and psychological saboteurs that break us. The investigation begins at the very source of our existence, written deeply into the code of life itself.
Genetics and family history, the ghost in the machine. To understand the architecture of mental illness, one must first descend into the microscopic universe of the human genome, a spiraling library of biological instructions that predates our consciousness by millennia. The concept that our psychological fate is, to a significant degree, pre-written in the code of our DNA is perhaps the most unsettling realization in the field of psychiatric medicine. For centuries, humanity viewed madness, melancholy, or manic euphoria as matters of the soul, moral failings, or demonic possession. Today, however, investigative science has illuminated the stark reality that the blueprint for mental disorder is often etched into the very foundation of our being before we take our first breath. We are not merely born into families, we are born into a genetic lineage that carries the chemical echoes of our ancestors' triumphs, traumas, and volatilities. The study of heritability in mental disorders has moved far beyond the simplistic nature versus nurture debates of the 20th century. We have entered the era of genomics and polygenic risk scores, revealing a picture of staggering complexity. Unlike Mendelian diseases, where a single gene mutation like that in Huntington's disease creates a predictive deterministic outcome, mental disorders are almost exclusively polygenic. This means they are the result of thousands of minute variations scattered across the entire genome. These small genetic quirks, known as single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, are individually harmless. However, when an individual inherits a specific constellation of these thousands of variations, they create a cumulative genetic loading. It is analogous to a structural flaw in a massive bridge. One loose bolt changes nothing, but thousands of microscopic fractures in the steel beams render the entire structure vulnerable to collapse under the winds of life. Schizophrenia and bipolar disorder serve as the primary case studies for this genetic inevitability. Extensive research, including massive genome-wide association studies (GWAS), involving hundreds of thousands of participants, has isolated specific loci on chromosomes associated with synaptic pruning, immune system regulation, and dopamine transmission. In identical twin studies, the gold standard of genetic research, if one twin develops schizophrenia, the other possesses roughly 50% chance of developing the disorder. Despite living in different environments, this statistic is a thunderous declaration of biological power. It suggests that for some, the neural pathways are wired for instability from the moment of conception. The brain's filtration systems, designed to process reality, are genetically compromised, rendering the individual susceptible to the hallucinations and delusions that characterize the disorder. However, the narrative of genetics is not simply one of hard-coded doom. It is also a story of biological sensitivity. This brings us to the ORCID hypothesis, a revolutionary framework in evolutionary psychology. Traditional views held that certain bad genes created vulnerability. The new science suggests that these genes actually create plasticity or sensitivity. Individuals with these genetic markers are not necessarily doomed to mental illness. Rather, they are hyper-reactive to their environment. Like an orchid, which requires perfect conditions to bloom but withers easily, these individuals can wither into depression or anxiety under neglect, yet they can also thrive spectacularly, surpassing their resilient peers if placed in a nurturing environment. This reframes the genetic cause of mental illness not as a defect, but as a mismatch between a highly sensitive genetic code and a harsh environment. The investigation into genetics delves even deeper, reaching into the shadowy realm of epigenetics. This is where the story of family history becomes a literal biological mechanism. Epigenetics is the study of how behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. Unlike genetic changes, epigenetic changes are reversible and do not change your DNA sequence, but they can change how your body reads a DNA sequence. Here lies the mechanism of inherited trauma. Historical analysis of the Dutch hunger winter of 1944 reveals that children born to mothers who starved during that famine were more prone to schizophrenia and depression decades later. The trauma of the mother altered the methylation of the DNA in the fetus. This suggests that the mental disorders we see today may be the ghostly reverberations of traumas suffered by grandparents we never met. The anxiety of a Holocaust survivor or the hypervigilance of a soldier in Vietnam can essentially modify the on-off switches of stress response genes in their offspring.
Furthermore, we must analyze the specific neurochemical blueprints passed down through generations.
The variation in the COMT gene, for instance, dictates how quickly the brain breaks down dopamine in the prefrontal cortex. Those with the MET-MET variation break down dopamine slowly, leading to higher cognitive performance but a significantly increased risk of anxiety and neuroticism under stress. Conversely, the VAL-VAL variation clears dopamine rapidly, creating a brain that is more resilient to stress but perhaps less cognitively agile in complex tasks. This is the genetic roll of the dice. A person born with a genetic predisposition for low serotonin production or overactive amygdala function enters the world with a thinner skin. They are fighting a battle against their own biology, requiring significantly less external pressure to trigger a depressive episode than someone with a robust genetic shield. The implications of genetic predisposition create a heavy psychological burden, the anticipatory anxiety of the family curse. In families where suicide, addiction, or severe depression runs rampant, the younger generation often grows up in the shadow of an inevitable decline. Every moment of sadness is scrutinized. Is this just a bad day, or is this the beginning of the end, just like it was for my father? This self-fulfilling prophecy, fueled by the knowledge of one's own genetic loading, can become a stressor in itself. The science confirms that while genes load the gun, the environment pulls the trigger. However, for those with a heavy genetic burden, the trigger is a hair trigger. The threshold for what constitutes a traumatic event is lowered. A breakup or a job loss that a genetically resilient person might bounce back from in a month could send a genetically vulnerable person into a spiral of major depressive disorder that lasts years. As we map the human genome with increasing precision, we are finding that mental illness is often a pleiotropic effect, where one gene influences two or more seemingly unrelated phenotypic traits. Genes associated with high creativity and intelligence often overlap with genes associated with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. This suggests that the genetic causes of mental disorders are not mistakes of evolution, but the price humanity pays for its complex cognitive abilities. The same genetic architecture that allows for artistic genius, abstract mathematics, and profound philosophical thought is the same architecture that, when slightly tweaked or placed under pressure, collapses into madness.
We are walking a genetic tightrope, and for millions of people, the balance was lost before they even took their first step.
2. Chronic stress and burnout, the erosion of the self. If genetics provides the blueprint for the building, chronic stress is the relentless acid rain that slowly dissolves the structure until it crumbles. In the modern era, chronic stress and burnout have transcended their status as mere occupational hazards to become the defining epidemiological crisis of the 21st century. This is not the sharp, adrenaline-fueled stress of our ancestors facing a predator. It is a pervasive, low-level, unceasing hum of anxiety that the human brain was never designed to endure. To understand how stress leads to mental disorder, we must dissect the physiology of the survival mechanism and how its malfunction in the modern world leads to catastrophic psychological failure. The mechanism at the heart of this destruction is the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is the command center for the body's response to danger. When a threat is perceived, the hypothalamus signals the pituitary gland, which in turn signals the adrenal glands to release glucocorticoids, primarily cortisol. In an evolutionary context, this system is brilliant. Cortisol mobilizes glucose for energy, suppresses non-essential functions like digestion and immune response, and sharpens focus. It is designed to save your life in a 15-minute encounter with a wolf. However, the modern human is not running from a wolf. We are navigating a labyrinth of deadlines, financial debts, social media comparison, political instability, and 24-hour connectivity. The threat is never resolved. Consequently, the HPA axis never shuts down. The neurobiological consequences of this always-on stress response are devastating. We are witnessing the literal atrophy of the brain. High levels of cortisol are neurotoxic. Prolonged exposure forces the neurons in the hippocampus, the region responsible for memory and emotional regulation, to shrink and disconnect. Simultaneously, chronic stress causes hypertrophy, enlargement of the amygdala, the brain's fear center. This creates a vicious physiological loop. The brain becomes physically worse at regulating emotion and remembering context, while becoming physically better at detecting threats and feeling fear. The result is a brain wired for anxiety and depression.
The individual loses the ability to distinguish between a life-threatening event and a minor inconvenience. Everything feels like a catastrophe because the neural machinery of perspective has been eroded. Burnout, officially recognized by the World Health Organization and the ICD-11, is the terminal stage of this chronic stress. It is distinct from mere exhaustion. Exhaustion is physical. Burnout is existential. It is characterized by three dimensions: feelings of energy depletion, increased mental distance or cynicism regarding one's job or life, and reduced professional efficacy. But beneath these clinical definitions lies a profound psychological rupture: depersonalization. The burned-out individual begins to feel detached from their own life, viewing their existence through a pane of
gray glass. This is the gateway to severe pathology. When the brain realizes that no amount of effort yields a reward or relief, a state known as learned helplessness, it shuts down dopamine production. The motivation circuits wither. This is the biological substrate of major depressive disorder. We must also investigate the societal architecture that manufactures this stress. We live in what philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls the burnout society. The disciplinary society of the past, controlled by should not, has been replaced by the achievement society, controlled by can. We are no longer exploited by external masters to the same degree. We are now self-exploiters. The modern individual is an entrepreneur of the self, constantly optimizing, upgrading, and performing. The blurred lines between work and rest, facilitated by the smartphone, mean the brain never enters the default mode network state necessary for recovery. We are subjected to a hyper-attention that fragments our focus and depletes our cognitive reserves. This systemic pressure creates a sense of inadequacy that is intrinsic to the capitalist structure, driving anxiety rates to historical highs. The physiological toll of chronic stress acts as a backdoor to mental illness through inflammation. We now know that depression is in part an inflammatory disease. Chronic stress triggers the immune system to release pro-inflammatory cytokines, as if the body were fighting an infection. These cytokines can cross the blood-brain barrier and alter neurotransmitter function, reducing serotonin and dopamine availability. This is known as Cygnus behavior, lethargy, withdrawal,
and loss of appetite, which overlaps almost perfectly with the symptoms of depression. Thus, chronic stress causes the body to attack the brain. The person is not just sad, they are systemically inflamed, their body fighting a war against a phantom enemy created by their environment. Furthermore, the phenomenon of allostatic load explains the cumulative damage. Allostasis is the process of achieving stability through change, adapting to stress. Allostatic load is the wear and tear on the body and brain resulting from chronic overactivity or underactivity of these systems. As the load increases over years of financial struggle, caregiving, or high-pressure employment, the system loses its elasticity. The breakdown is often sudden. We see this in nervous breakdowns, where a high-functioning individual suddenly becomes catatonic or psychotic. The reserves are simply gone. The neurotransmitters are depleted, the receptors are desensitized, and the structural integrity of the emotional regulation circuits fails. The impact of chronic stress is also deeply tied to the loss of control. Studies on both animals and humans confirm that stress is most damaging when it is unpredictable and uncontrollable. Modern life is defined by this unpredictability: economic volatility, precarious employment, the gig economy, and the chaotic influx of global news. This creates a state of vigilance fatigue. The brain is constantly scanning for the next threat. This hypervigilance eventually morphs into generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, or panic disorder. The panic attack is the body's false alarm system going off because the calibration has been destroyed by years of chronic pressure. Finally, we must acknowledge the interplay between stress and sleep, which will be covered later but is relevant here. Chronic stress induces a state of hyperarousal that makes restorative sleep impossible. Without the nightly glymphatic cleaning of the brain, metabolic waste products accumulate, further poisoning the neural environment. This accelerates the descent into mental disorder. The tragedy of chronic stress is that it is often celebrated before it is diagnosed. The sleepless nights, the skipping of meals, the obsession with productivity, these are lauded as virtues of the ambitious until the moment of collapse. By the time the diagnosis of clinical depression or anxiety is made, the stress has often been remodeling the brain for a decade. It is a slow-motion car crash,
where the damage is accumulating invisibly until the chassis finally snaps. Thus, chronic stress is not merely a contributor to mental disorders, it is an active, aggressive sculptor of the disordered mind. It reshapes the brain's physical structure, alters its chemical balance, and corrupts the immune system, transforming a healthy human into a vessel of anxiety and despair. It is the price of admission to a world that moves faster than our biology can comprehend.
To comprehend the genesis of mental disorder, we must return to the construction site of the human consciousness, childhood. The infant brain is not merely a small version of an adult brain, it is a voracious, unfinished biological project, an organ of pure potentiality that doubles in size in the first year of life. During this critical window of neuroplasticity, the brain is not simply learning skills, it is building the very infrastructure of reality, laying down the fiber optic cables of emotion, trust, and survival. When this delicate process is interrupted by trauma, abuse, or neglect, the result is not merely a painful memory, it is a catastrophic structural failure. The architecture of the mind is warped, creating a distorted lens through which the individual will view the world for the rest of their existence. This is the realm of developmental trauma disorder, a silent epidemic that serves as the root cause for a staggering percentage of psychiatric diagnoses, from borderline personality disorder to severe addiction. The investigation into the link between childhood trauma and adult mental illness reached a watershed moment in the late 1990s with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and Kaiser Permanente.
This monumental piece of epidemiological research surveyed over 17,000 individuals, counting the number of adverse categories they experienced before age 18, such as physical abuse, sexual abuse, household dysfunction, or parental incarceration. The findings were nothing short of a medical revolution. The study revealed a direct dose-response relationship between the ACE score and adult pathology. An individual with an ACE score at 4 or higher was found to be exponentially more likely to attempt suicide, develop severe depression, or succumb to substance abuse. This shifted the psychiatric paradigm from the question, "What is wrong with you?" to the far more incisive inquiry, "What happened to you?" It provided irrefutable data that mental illness is often a logical, downstream consequence of early environmental toxicity. The biological mechanism of this damage is rooted in the developing nervous system's adaptation to a hostile environment. A child growing up in a home defined by violence, chaos, or emotional neglect exists in a state of chronic threat. In response,
their developing brain prioritizes the growth of the survival brain, the brainstem and the amygdala, over the learning brain, the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala, responsible for detecting danger, becomes hypertrophic and hyperreactive. It becomes a faulty smoke detector that screams fire at the smell of burnt toast. Simultaneously, the hippocampus, vital for memory integration and distinguishing past from present, is stunted by the neurotoxic effects of cortisol. This results in a brain that is wired for hypervigilance. The child learns to scan faces for micro-expressions of anger, to interpret silence as a precursor to violence, and to dissociate from their own body to escape pain. These adaptations, brilliant for surviving a dangerous childhood, become maladaptive pathologies in adulthood. The hypervigilance manifests as generalized anxiety disorder. The dissociation manifests as depersonalization or dissociative identity disorders. The inability to regulate intense emotions manifests as bipolar or borderline traits. We must also delve deeply into the concept of complex PTSD, CPTSD, a condition distinct from the PTSD associated with a single traumatic event like a car crash or war zone explosion. Childhood trauma is rarely a single event. It is an atmosphere, a climate of fear or neglect that permeates the developmental years. This chronic exposure leads to a fragmentation of the self. In normal development, a child integrates their various emotional states into a cohesive identity through the mirroring provided by a caregiver. When the caregiver is the source of terror, a paradox known as fright without solution, the child's attachment system collapses. They cannot flee the caregiver because they depend on them for survival, but they cannot approach them because they are dangerous. This induces a state of disorganized attachment, where the child's nervous system oscillates violently between sympathetic fight-flight and the dorsal vagal freeze or shutdown states. In adulthood, this manifests as the chaotic interpersonal relationships often seen in personality disorders, a desperate come-here-go-away push-pull dynamic that mirrors the original trauma bond. The physiological imprint of childhood abuse extends into the deepest recesses of the body, corroborating the seminal work of Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who famously posited that the body keeps the score.
Trauma is not just a story stored in the mind, it is etched into the tissue. Survivors of early abuse often exhibit a baseline physiology of inflammation. Their stress response systems are permanently calibrated to a wartime setting, flooding the body with inflammatory cytokines even in times of peace. This creates a bridge between mental and physical illness, explaining why trauma survivors have significantly higher rates of autoimmune diseases, heart disease, and cancer. The mental disorder is, in many ways, a symptom of a systemic physiological dysregulation. The brain, constantly bathed in stress hormones, loses its synaptic density. The connections between the emotional centers and the logical centers are severed, making top-down regulation, using logic to calm down, nearly impossible. This is why talk therapy alone often fails for deep trauma. The logical brain cannot talk the survival brain out of a reaction it has been practicing since infancy. Furthermore, we must examine the specific devastation caused by sexual abuse, arguably the most invasive form of childhood trauma. This violation shatters the victim's sense of bodily autonomy and introduces a toxic confusion between intimacy, pain, and secrecy. The psychological fallout is profound and specific. It often leads to a severe fracturing of the psyche, where the victim compartmentalizes the abuse to survive, leading to profound dissociative barriers. In adulthood, this can manifest as somatic symptom disorders, where the psychological pain is converted into unexplained physical pain, seizures, or paralysis. The shame associated with sexual abuse acts as a potent fertilizer for addiction, as the survivor seeks any chemical means to numb the intrusive memories and the sensation of being soiled or damaged. The betrayal inherent in sexual abuse, often perpetrated by a trusted figure, destroys the capacity for trust, isolating the individual in a fortress of solitude that breeds severe depression. The tragedy of childhood trauma is compounded by the phenomenon of epigenetic transmission, suggesting that the effects of abuse can echo through generations. Research indicates that the extreme stress of trauma can alter the expression of genes in the germline. This means that a child abused today may pass on a biological vulnerability to stress to their grandchildren, even if those grandchildren are raised in safety. This adds a layer of biological determinism to the cycle of violence.
However, the most insidious aspect of childhood trauma is the theft of the self. Before a child has the chance to discover who they are forced to become who they need to be to survive. They become the pleaser, the invisible one, or the protector. The mental disorders of adulthood are often the cracking of these masks. The depression is the exhaustion of holding up the facade. The anxiety is the fear that the facade is slipping. Finally, we must consider the societal blindness that allows this to continue. For decades, society minimized childhood emotional neglect, viewing it as less harmful than physical abuse. We now know that the absence of love is as damaging to brain development as the presence of violence. The still face experiment demonstrated that an infant falls into distress within seconds of a mother becoming unresponsive. Years of emotional unresponsiveness result in a brain that believes it does not exist, leading to deep narcissistic wounding and a lifelong hollow emptiness that no amount of external success can fill. This void is the breeding ground for the most intractable depressive disorders. The investigation into childhood trauma reveals that our mental health wards are filled not necessarily with the sick, but with the injured. Adults carrying the unhealed, shattered remains of their own childhoods, trapped in a time loop of terror that their conscious minds can barely comprehend.
4. Major life events and loss, the shock of the new reality. If childhood trauma is the faulty foundation, major life events are the earthquakes that test the structural integrity of the adult mind. While the human brain is designed for adaptation, it craves homeostasis, predictability, routine, and a coherent narrative of the future. When a major life event strikes, be it the death of a loved one, a catastrophic divorce, the loss of a career, or financial ruin, it does not merely sadden the individual, it violently ruptures their assumptive world. This psychological concept refers to the set of internal assumptions we hold about safety, identity, and the order of the universe. When these pillars are knocked down, the psyche enters a state of free fall. The resulting mental disorders are not just reactions to sadness, they are manifestations of a cognitive and existential collapse, where the brain frantically attempts to map a terrain that has become suddenly, terrifyingly unrecognizable. To quantify this impact, psychiatrists and sociologists utilize tools like the Holmes-Rahe stress scale, which assigns a numerical value to life stressors to predict the likelihood of illness. It reveals a chilling truth: the cumulative weight of life changes, even positive ones, can crush the nervous system. However, it is the events characterized by loss and uncontrollability that serve as the primary triggers for major pathology. We must begin with the most profound of these: grief. While grief is a natural human response, complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder is a pathological deviation where the brain fails to integrate the reality of the loss. Neuroimaging studies of grieving brains show activation in the nucleus accumbens, the reward center, suggesting that the brain is in a state of addiction, craving the presence of the deceased with the same biological intensity as a heroin addict craves the drug. When that craving is unmet, the withdrawal is agonizing. The mourner remains stuck in the acute phase of shock, leading to severe depression, suicidal ideation, and a total cessation of functioning. The dual process model of coping breaks down. The individual cannot oscillate between loss and restoration, but instead drowns in the loss. Divorce and relationship dissolution represent a unique category of trauma, often described as death without a funeral. It is a disentangling of a shared neural existence. In a long-term partnership, the brain literally outsources certain regulatory functions to the partner: emotional soothing, memory storage, even physiological regulation. When the relationship is severed, the individual undergoes a biological dysregulation, the immune system crashes, and the risk of a major depressive episode spikes. Beyond the biological, divorce is a status trauma. It often involves a humiliating public admission of failure, a loss of social standing, and a terrifying financial recalibration. The legal system, adversarial by nature, acts as a secondary traumatizing agent, keeping the individuals in a state of high conflict fight or flight for years. This prolonged stress creates a fertile ground for adjustment disorders to metastasize into clinical depression or anxiety disorders, particularly in men, who statistically lose their primary emotional support system when a marriage dissolves. We must also investigate the devastating psychological impact of job loss and financial collapse, particularly in the hyper-capitalist context of the 21st century. In modern society, what you do is often synonymous with who you are. Employment provides not just income, but structure, social contact, and a sense of purpose. When this is stripped away, whether through firing, redundancy, or corporate collapse, the individual suffers a status syndrome shock. The loss of the provider role triggers deep, evolutionarily rooted shame mechanisms, particularly in cultures that emphasize individual merit. The brain interprets this social rejection as a survival threat. Studies following the 2008 global financial crisis showed a direct correlation between unemployment rates and spikes in suicide and mental hospital admissions. The uncertainty of financial ruin creates a specific type of entrapment anxiety. The individual sees no way out, no future, and no safety. This hopelessness is the primary cognitive precursor to suicidality. The concept of futurelessness takes hold. The brain loses its ability to imagine a tomorrow that is bearable.
Furthermore, we must address the impact of medical trauma in the diagnosis of life-altering illnesses, a precursor to entry number 9 but distinct as an event. Receiving a diagnosis of cancer, HIV, or a degenerative condition is a flashbulb memory event, a moment of shock that cleaves time into before and after. The immediate psychological sequelae often mirror PTSD, intrusive thoughts about death, hyperarousal,
and avoidance of medical reminders. This medical PTSD is frequently overlooked. The patient is treated for the body while the mind is left to grapple with the sudden confrontation with mortality. The existential terror induced by such news can precipitate a rapid decline into severe anxiety and depression, which in turn weakens the immune system's ability to fight the physical disease, creating a deadly psychosomatic spiral. The phenomenon of loss of status extends beyond employment. It encompasses the loss of a dream, a reputation, or a community. We see this in the cancellation culture of the digital age, where an individual can go from celebrated to pariah in 24 hours. This social death triggers the same neural pathways as physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex lights up, signaling that exclusion is a threat to survival, a holdover from our tribal past where banishment meant death. For a person subjected to public shaming or a sudden fall from grace, the psychological pressure is immense. The isolation is immediate. The resulting paranoia and depression are severe, often leading to a complete withdrawal from society, hikikomori, or a breakdown into psychotic breaks as the mind tries to escape the unbearable reality of the present. It is critical to understand the cumulative nature of these events. Often it is not one single event that breaks the mind, but a cascade of loss. A job loss leads to financial strain, which leads to marital conflict, which leads to divorce, which leads to housing instability. This domino effect overwhelms the individual's coping reserve. Every human has a finite amount of psychological energy to adapt to change. When the demand exceeds the supply, the system crashes. This is often where we see the onset of brief psychotic disorder or major dissociation. The reality becomes too painful to inhabit, so the brain creates a new, delusional reality. Moreover, the cultural context of how we handle loss plays a massive role in whether a life event leads to a disorder. We live in a culture of toxic positivity and efficiency. Grief is allotted a few days of compassionate leave. Divorce is expected to be gotten over. We lack the rituals and community containers that ancient cultures used to process transition and loss. Consequently, individuals are forced to privatize their pain. They attempt to carry the weight of an existential crisis while maintaining the productivity of a worker bee.
This dissonance, the gap between the internal devastation and the external performance, is where the mental fracture occurs. The energy required to maintain the mask depletes the resources needed for healing. Finally, we must consider the identity crisis that underpins all these events. Mental stability is largely dependent on a stable sense of self. I am a wife. I am a banker. I am a healthy person. When a major life event strips these labels away, the individual is forced to confront the void. Who am I now? This existential vacuum is terrifying. For those with underlying vulnerabilities, as discussed in entry number 1, this loss of structure is the tipping point. The brain, unable to tolerate the ambiguity of an undefined self, may retreat into the rigid structures of obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, or the numbing embrace of addiction. The major life event acts as a harsh spotlight, revealing the cracks in the psyche that were previously hidden by the routine of daily life. It is the moment the script runs out and the improvisation begins, an improvisation that for many descends into the tragic cacophony of mental illness.
5. Substance abuse, the chemical hijacking of the soul. We enter now into the volatile realm of neurochemistry, where the line between self-medication and self-destruction blurs into a tragic, invisible war. Substance abuse is not merely a symptom of mental instability, it is a primary, aggressive architect of psychiatric disorder. For decades, society viewed addiction through a moralistic lens, a failing of character or willpower. Modern neuroscience, however, has stripped away these antiquated prejudices to reveal a terrifying mechanical reality. Psychoactive substances are chemical hackers. They infiltrate the brain's delicate operating system, rewrite the code of survival, and fundamentally alter the machinery of perception, emotion, and will. This is the story of the dual diagnosis, the chicken and egg paradox, where the cure becomes the disease and the brain is left trapped in a labyrinth of its own making. To understand how substances manufacture mental illness, we must look at the brain's reward pathway, the mesolimbic dopamine system. This ancient circuit stretching from the ventral tegmental area, VTA, to the nucleus accumbens evolved to ensure our survival. It rewards us with a burst of dopamine, the molecule of more, when we eat, procreate, or succeed. Drugs and alcohol short-circuit the system. They do not just tickle the reward center, they hit it with a sledgehammer.
A line of cocaine or a shot of methamphetamine releases a tidal wave of dopamine hundreds of times more potent than any natural experience. The brain, overwhelmed by this chemical tsunami, attempts to protect itself through a process called downregulation. It strips away dopamine receptors, effectively deafening itself to the noise. The result is anhedonia, a profound inability to feel pleasure from normal life. The sky is less blue, food tastes like ash, and love feels hollow. This biologically induced despair is indistinguishable from major clinical depression, yet it is entirely manufactured by the substance. Alcohol, the world's most socially acceptable social lubricant, is perhaps the most insidious agent of mental decline. It is a dirty drug, meaning it affects multiple neurotransmitter systems simultaneously. It mimics GABA, the brain's braking system, creating relaxation, while blocking glutamate, the brain's gas pedal. When the alcohol wears off, the brain attempts to recalibrate by flooding the system with glutamate and suppressing GABA.
The result is a state of hyperexcitability known as hangxiety. For the chronic drinker, this becomes a permanent state of being. The brain, anticipating the nightly sedative, rewires itself to be perpetually anxious and agitated. This is the physiological basis of alcohol-induced anxiety disorders. Furthermore, long-term alcohol abuse physically shrinks the brain, particularly the frontal lobes responsible for impulse control and emotional regulation. In severe cases, it leads to Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, a form of dementia and psychosis caused by thiamine deficiency, where the sufferer hallucinates and confabulates, permanently detached from reality. We must also confront the complex and controversial relationship between cannabis and psychosis. As legalization sweeps the globe, the narrative has shifted to the benign nature of the plant. However, psychiatric epidemiology tells a more nuanced and concerning story, particularly regarding the high-potency skunk strains that dominate the modern market. These strains contain massive levels of THC, the psychoactive component, and negligible levels of CBD, the antipsychotic buffer. For the developing adolescent brain, particularly those with the genetic vulnerability discussed in entry number 1, such as the COMT gene variation, high-potency cannabis can be the key that unlocks the door to schizophrenia. It disrupts the pruning of synapses and alters the dopamine signaling in the striatum. Studies have shown that daily use of high-potency cannabis can increase the risk of developing a psychotic disorder by up to 5 times. This is not to say cannabis creates schizophrenia in everyone, but it acts as a potent environmental stressor that can trigger a latent condition that might otherwise have remained dormant forever. The stimulant crisis, involving cocaine, methamphetamine, and prescription amphetamines, presents a different avenue to madness, stimulant psychosis. These drugs force the brain to dump its entire reserve of neurotransmitters at once. The sleep deprivation that accompanies a binge, combined with the hyperdopaminergic state, leads to a disintegration of reality testing. The user begins to see shadow people in their peripheral vision, hears voices plotting against them, and develops intricate paranoid delusions. While these symptoms often subside after detoxification, for a significant percentage of users, the psychosis does not clear. The brain has been pushed past its elastic limit.
And the paranoia becomes chronic. This phenomenon, known as kindling, means that with each relapse, the brain becomes more sensitive, requiring less of the drug to trigger a full-blown psychotic break. The opioid epidemic has introduced a new dimension of chemical depression. Opioids rewire the brain's pain management system, the endorphin receptors. Long-term use lowers the threshold for pain, a condition called hyperalgesia, but it also lowers the threshold for emotional pain. The user becomes emotionally brittle, unable to tolerate the slightest stressor without chemical buffering. When the drug is removed, the dysphoria, unease, and dissatisfaction is catastrophic. The suicide rate among opioid users is staggering, not just due to accidental overdose, but due to the profound chemically induced darkness that descends when the receptors are screaming for occupancy. This is a hijacking of the hierarchy of needs. The drug becomes more important than food, water, or safety, and the loss of it feels like a literal death, driving the panic and desperation that characterizes the addiction. We must also analyze the phenomenon of self-medication, which complicates the causal chain. Many individuals suffering from untreated anxiety, ADHD, or trauma turn to substances to regulate their internal state. The social anxiety sufferer drinks to loosen up. The trauma survivor uses opiates to numb the pain. The undiagnosed ADHD patient uses speed to focus. While this provides temporary relief, it ultimately exacerbates the underlying condition. The rebound effect ensures that the anxiety returns with a vengeance once the alcohol leaves the system. This creates a vicious cycle. The substance causes the symptoms it is being used to treat. Over time, the substance abuse becomes the primary driver of the mental illness, masking the original issue so deeply that clinicians often cannot tell where the trauma ends and the addiction begins. There is also a profound structural change that occurs at the genetic level, involving a protein called delta FOSB. This molecular switch accumulates in the reward neurons with every exposure to a drug.
Unlike other proteins that degrade quickly, delta FosB is stable and builds up over time, eventually altering gene expression to physically change the structure of the nerve cells. It creates more dendritic spines, more connections, that are specifically wired to seek the drug. This is the biological footprint of addiction.
It explains why cravings can persist for years after sobriety. The brain has been physically architected to demand the substance. This structural change impairs the prefrontal cortex, the seat of judgment and restraint. The stop button in the brain is disconnected from the go button. This loss of executive function is a hallmark of many mental disorders, leading to the impulsivity and emotional volatility seen in bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder. Finally, we must consider the cultural impact of the war on drugs and the stigmatization of substance use. By criminalizing addiction, society forces users into the shadows, increasing the stress, trauma, and isolation that fuel the cycle of abuse. The substances themselves are often adulterated with unknown chemicals, like fentanyl or xylazine, introducing new neurological toxins that cause rapid cognitive decline and necrotic tissue damage. The modern landscape of designer drugs and synthetic cathinones, bath salts, presents a terrifying frontier where a single dose can induce permanent excitotoxicity, frying neurons and leaving the user in a persistent vegetative or psychotic state. In conclusion, substance abuse is not a passive habit. It is an active, aggressive rewiring of the human machine. It depletes the chemical reserves of happiness, erodes the structural integrity of the will, and ultimately enslaves the conscious mind to a primitive biological imperative. It transforms the brain from a complex organ of reason and emotion into a simple, desperate engine of consumption, leaving a trail of shattered psyches in its wake.
6. Sleep deprivation and poor sleep quality, the erosion of sanity. If the brain is a bustling metropolis of electrical activity, sleep is the critical infrastructure maintenance that keeps the city from collapsing into chaos. For most of human history, sleep was viewed as a passive state, a shutting down of the system to save energy. Today, we know this is a dangerous fallacy. Sleep is a highly active, metabolically intense state that is absolutely foundational to sanity. The investigation into the link between sleep deprivation and mental disorder reveals a stark truth. There is no major psychiatric condition in which sleep disturbances are not a contributing symptom, and increasingly, evidence suggests they are often the cause. We are living in the midst of a catastrophic sleep loss epidemic, as termed by neuroscientist Matthew Walker, and our collective mental health is paying the price. The most revolutionary discovery in sleep science in the last decade is the existence of the glymphatic system. For centuries, anatomy textbooks stated that the brain was the only organ without a lymphatic system to clear out metabolic waste. We now know that during deep NREM, non-rapid eye movement sleep, the brain's glial cells shrink by up to 60%, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to wash through the tissue and flush out toxins. One of these toxins is beta amyloid, the protein plaque associated with Alzheimer's disease. Without deep sleep, the Sewage system fails. The brain literally bathes in its own toxic waste. This accumulation of metabolic debris leads to cognitive fog, memory failure, and the slow degradation of neural health that underpins dementia and cognitive decline. But the immediate psychiatric impact is even more profound. To understand the emotional regulation aspect of sleep, we must look at REM, rapid eye movement sleep. This is the stage of vivid dreaming, and it serves as overnight therapy. During REM sleep, the brain reprocesses the emotional memories of the day. Crucially, it does this in a neurochemical environment completely devoid of noradrenaline, the anxiety molecule. This allows the brain to strip the painful emotional charge from the memory, retaining only the informational narrative. It is the difference between remembering that you were in a car crash and reliving the terror of the car crash. When we are sleep deprived, we miss out on this REM processing. As a result, we retain the visceral,
stinging emotional charge of every negative experience. The brain becomes a raw nerve. This failure of emotional processing is a key mechanism in post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, where the recurring nightmares suggest a failure of the REM mechanism to integrate the trauma. The neurological disconnect caused by sleep deprivation is visible on an MRI. In a well-rested brain, the prefrontal cortex, the logical CEO, exerts a dampening regulatory control over the amygdala, the emotional alarm bell. Sleep deprivation severs the connection between these two regions. Without the adult supervision of the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala becomes up to 60% more reactive to negative stimuli. The sleepy brain reverts to a primitive, reactive pattern. Neutral faces look hostile, minor problems feel like catastrophes. This state of hyperarousal and emotional lability mimics the symptoms of anxiety disorders and bipolar mania almost perfectly. In fact, sleep deprivation is a known trigger for manic episodes and bipolar disorder. The loss of sleep acts as a stimulant, pushing the already vulnerable brain into a state of frenetic, disorganized energy. We must also examine the bidirectional relationship between sleep and depression. For decades, doctors viewed insomnia as a secondary symptom of depression. New research suggests it is often a precursor. The relationship is circular and self-reinforcing. Depression alters sleep architecture, often causing patients to enter REM sleep too quickly, skipping the restorative deep sleep. This results in dream-disturbed sleep that leaves the patient exhausted.
Conversely, chronic insomnia doubles the risk of developing major depression. The mechanism involves the serotonin receptors, which become desensitized without rest. The learned helplessness of lying awake night after night, unable to control one's own consciousness, erodes self-efficacy and breeds the despair central to the depressive experience. The modern environment has declared war on sleep, primarily through the destruction of our circadian rhythms. We are diurnal creatures, evolved to rise with the sun and sleep with the dark. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN, in the hypothalamus governs this rhythm, primarily through the release of melatonin. The ubiquity of LED screens and blue light in the evening tricks the SCN into believing it is still noon. This suppresses melatonin production and delays sleep onset, creating a state of social jet lag.
We are living in a time zone that doesn't exist. This chronic misalignment dysynchronizes the body's clocks, not just in the brain, but in the liver, the heart, and the gut. This internal chaos is a major stressor, elevating cortisol levels and keeping the body in a state of low-grade fight or flight that prevents the nervous system from ever truly settling. Shift work represents the most extreme form of this circadian disruption. The World Health Organization has classified night shift work as a probable carcinogen, but it is also a potent psychogen. Shift workers have drastically higher rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide. The constant fighting against biological gravity wears down the psyche. The isolation of being awake when the world sleeps, combined with the physiological strain, creates a profound sense of alienation and fatigue that makes emotional resilience impossible. Furthermore, we must address the specific torture of sleep apnea. This condition, often undiagnosed, involves the repeated collapse of the airway during sleep, causing the sufferer to stop breathing hundreds of times a night. Each time breathing stops, the brain panics, spikes adrenaline, and wakes the body up just enough to gasp. The person may not remember waking up, but they never achieve deep restorative sleep. They spend the night in a state of intermittent hypoxia, oxygen deprivation. The cumulative effect of starving the brain of oxygen night after night is devastating. It leads to significant cognitive impairment, severe mood swings, and is a major, often treatable, cause of treatment-resistant depression. The cultural glorification of sleep deprivation, the hustle culture that views sleep as a weakness or a luxury, is a societal pathology. We wear our exhaustion like a badge of honor, unaware that we are boasting about our own cognitive decline. The phrase, "I'll sleep when I'm dead," is tragically ironic, as sleep deprivation significantly accelerates mortality. From a mental health perspective, the lack of sleep reduces our distress tolerance. It makes us brittle. A well-rested mind is like water, it can flow around obstacles. A sleep-deprived mind is like glass, it shatters under pressure. Finally, the connection between sleep and the future of mental health is undeniable. As we move into an era of 24/7 connectivity and increasing artificial illumination, we are pushing the human animal further away from its biological baseline.
We are conducting an uncontrolled experiment on the global brain. The rise in anxiety disorders in teenagers, for instance, correlates strongly with the intrusion of smartphones into the bedroom and the subsequent loss of sleep. We are raising a generation of the chronically sleep-deprived, whose developing brains are missing the critical nightly window of neuroplasticity and emotional pruning. In summary, sleep is not merely the absence of wakefulness, it is the guardian of the mind. It is the nightly tune-up that rebalances our neurochemistry, consolidates our memories, and heals our emotional wounds. To deprive the brain of sleep is to strip it of its armor. It leaves the psyche exposed, raw, and vulnerable to the chaos of existence. Without the sanctuary of sleep, the mind cannot hold itself together, and the slide into disorder becomes not just a risk, but a physiological inevitability.
7. Social isolation and loneliness, the silent extinction of the self. To understand the catastrophic impact of social isolation on the human mind, we must first strip away the modern veneer of independence and return to the primordial truth of our species. Human beings are obligate social animals. For 2 million years, our survival did not depend on sharp claws, thick fur, or blistering speed. It depended entirely on the tried. In the harsh environment of the Pleistocene, separation from the group was a death sentence. It meant starvation, predation, or freezing. Consequently, the human brain evolved a biological alarm system to prevent this separation. That alarm is what we call loneliness. It is not merely a feeling. It is a visceral, agonizing warning signal, akin to hunger or thirst, designed to drive us back towards the safety of the collective. When that signal is ignored or cannot be resolved, the brain enters a state of self-preservation that is fundamentally incompatible with mental health. In the modern era, we are witnessing a sociological paradox that is destroying our psychological resilience. We are the most connected society in human history, yet we are in the grip of a devastating loneliness epidemic. The social brain hypothesis posits that the neocortex expanded specifically to manage complex social networks. When we are denied these networks, the hardware of the brain begins to malfunction. Neuroimaging studies using fMRI have revealed a chilling correlation. The pain of social rejection activates the exact same neural regions as physical pain, specifically the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula.
To the brain, a broken heart is indistinguishable from a broken bone. This crossover explains why loneliness is so deeply distressing. It is a physical assault on the nervous system. The physiological consequences of chronic isolation are profound and serve as the biological substrate for mental disorders. When an individual feels socially isolated, their brain shifts into a hypervigilant state. Evolutionarily, if you were alone in the wild, you had to be ready to fight or flee at any second. Therefore, the lonely brain becomes hypersensitive to threats. It begins to interpret neutral facial expressions as hostile and ambiguous social cues as rejections. This cognitive distortion is the seed of social anxiety and paranoia. The lonely individual perceives the world as a more dangerous place.
Not because the world has changed, but because their internal threat detection threshold has been lowered to a hair trigger sensitivity. Simultaneously, the body mounts a defensive response known as the Conserved Transcriptional Response to Adversity, or CTRA. In a lonely individual, genes that regulate inflammation are upregulated, turned on, while genes that fight viruses are downregulated, turned off. The logic is brutal. If you are alone, you are more likely to suffer a physical wound from a predator, requiring inflammation to heal, than to catch a virus from a peer, requiring antiviral response. While this was brilliant for a caveman, for a modern human, it is a disaster. Chronic inflammation is neurotoxic. It degrades the blood-brain barrier and reduces the production of neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. This inflammatory pathway is now understood to be a primary driver of major depressive disorder. The lethargy and withdrawal seen in depression may actually be an evolutionary sickness behavior, a way for the body to conserve energy to heal from the injury of isolation. We must also investigate the structural changes that occur in the isolated brain. Research indicates that the white matter, the cabling that connects different brain regions, begins to degrade in the prefrontal cortex of socially isolated individuals. This degradation impairs executive function, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Furthermore, isolation accelerates cognitive decline. The use it or lose it principle applies to social cognition. Without the complex mental gymnastics required to navigate relationships, the neural networks atrophy. This explains why loneliness is one of the single strongest predictors of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. The mind, lacking the mirror of the other, loses its definition of the self. The cultural architecture of the 21st century has engineered a perfect storm for isolation. We have replaced the village square with the digital feed. The rise of social media has created a phenomenon known as displacement, where face-to-face interaction is replaced by screen time. The digital connection acts as junk food for the social brain. It provides a momentary hit of dopamine but lacks the nutrient density of real connection, specifically the release of oxytocin and endogenous opioids that occur during eye contact and physical touch.
This touch starvation or skin hunger is a critical component of the mental health crisis. Humans regulate each other's nervous systems through co-regulation. A hug, a handshake, or a reassuring hand on the shoulder lowers cortisol levels almost instantly. Without this tactile feedback, the nervous system remains stuck in a loop of high-stress arousal, leading to burnout and anxiety. We must also address the demographic shifts that have exacerbated this issue. The breakdown of the extended family, the rise of single-person households, and the increase in geographical mobility mean that millions of people lack a safety net. This is particularly devastating for the elderly, who face a shrinking social convoy as peers die and mobility decreases. However, the most alarming rise in loneliness is among Generation Z. Despite being digital natives, they report the highest levels of isolation. This suggests that the digital landscape is a landscape of ghosts, a place of performance rather than connection, fueling a comparison culture that deepens feelings of inadequacy and alienation. A specific extreme manifestation of this is the hikikomori phenomenon, originating in Japan but now spreading globally. These are individuals, typically young men, who withdraw entirely from society, locking themselves in their bedrooms for months or years. This is not merely laziness, it is a severe social phobia and existential retreat. It represents a total collapse of the drive to integrate. The mental state of the hikikomori is often a blend of severe depression, avoidant personality disorder, and a deep, crushing shame. This phenomenon highlights the danger of a society that prioritizes economic productivity over communal belonging. When the pressure to succeed becomes unbearable and the support systems are non-existent, the mind chooses total withdrawal as the only viable survival strategy. The vicious cycle of loneliness is perhaps its most tragic feature. As the brain becomes more threat-sensitive, the lonely individual becomes more defensive, self-centered, and socially awkward. They may lash out or withdraw further to protect themselves from rejection. This behavior pushes others away, confirming the individual's belief that they are unlovable and unsafe. This self-fulfilling prophecy creates a deep well of despair that is incredibly difficult to climb out of without intervention.
The resulting mental state is often a complex grief, a mourning for the loss of connection that the human spirit craves. Furthermore, we must look at the impact of urbanization. We live in dense cities, surrounded by millions, yet this density often breeds anonymity. The bystander effect and the sensory overload of the metropolis cause people to put up walls, avoiding eye contact and interaction to preserve their sanity. This crowded loneliness is particularly corrosive because the possibility of connection is visible but inaccessible. It creates a sense of being an outsider in one's own species. In conclusion, social isolation is not a lifestyle choice. It is a biological state of emergency. It fundamentally alters the way the genes are expressed, the way the brain processes reality, and the way the immune system functions. It strips the individual of the biological buffer that protects them from stress. The mental disorders that arise from isolation, depression, anxiety, paranoia, addiction, are the screams of a social organ that is slowly dying of starvation. As we move into a future of increasing automation, remote work, and virtual reality, the preservation of authentic, messy, biological human connection may well be the defining mental health challenge of our time.
8. Brain chemistry and hormonal imbalances, the alchemy of madness. To peer into the chemical causes of mental disorder is to look into the engine room of the human soul. For much of the 20th century, psychiatry was dominated by the chemical imbalance theory, the idea that depression is simply low serotonin or anxiety is just high adrenaline. Today, we know this is a gross oversimplification, a cartoon sketch of a masterpiece. The reality is far more intricate, involving a dynamic, shifting symphony of neurotransmitters, hormones, and neuropeptides that function not just as fuel, but as information keys unlocking specific neural pathways. When this chemical alchemy falls out of balance, the result is not just a mood swing, it is a fundamental distortion of reality, a hijacking of the very lens through which we perceive existence. We must begin with the big three neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. While the low serotonin causes depression theory has been heavily critiqued for its lack of nuance, the role of serotonin, 5-HT, as a master regulator is undeniable. It does not just make you happy, it regulates the gain control of neural networks. It helps the brain prioritize information. When serotonin transmission is dysregulated, whether through low production, hyperactive reuptake pumps, or insensitive receptors, the brain loses its ability to filter negative information. The noise of life becomes overwhelming. The individual obsessively ruminates on negative thoughts because the chemical braking system that usually stops those loops is failing. This is the mechanism of obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, and the ruminative spiral of major depression. Dopamine, often mislabeled as the pleasure molecule, is more accurately the molecule of desire and prediction error. It tells the brain, pay attention, this is important. In conditions like schizophrenia, the prevailing dopamine hypothesis suggests a hyperdopaminergic state in the striatum. The brain is flooded with salience. Suddenly, the license plate on a passing car, the lyric of a song, or the random glance of a stranger feels incredibly cosmically significant. The brain weaves these random data points into a complex delusion to explain the heightened sense of meaning. Conversely, in ADHD and severe depression, we see a hypodopaminergic state, a reward deficiency syndrome. The brain cannot generate enough interest to initiate action.
The lethargy is not laziness, it is a mechanical failure of the ignition system. The will to act exists, but the chemical spark to fire the engine is absent. However, the investigation must go deeper than these monoamines. We must look at the balance of glutamate and GABA, the brain's gas pedal and brake. Glutamate is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter. It allows for learning and memory. But when glutamate runs unchecked, a state known as excitotoxicity, it burns out neurons. This storm of electrical activity is implicated in the manic phases of bipolar disorder and the severe agitation of panic attacks. GABA, the inhibitory transmitter, calms this storm. In individuals with severe anxiety disorders, the GABA receptors are often malformed or desensitized, meaning the brain has no way to self-soothe. It is a car careening down a mountain with the brake lines cut. Beyond neurotransmitters, we enter the powerful realm of endocrinology, the hormones. The brain does not float in a jar. It is bathed in the chemical soup of the body. The thyroid gland serves as a critical, often overlooked architect of mental stability. Hypothyroidism, underactive thyroid, mimics the symptoms of clinical depression so perfectly, fatigue, brain fog, weight gain, sadness, that it is often misdiagnosed. The lack of thyroid hormone slows down cerebral metabolism. The brain literally has less energy to process emotion. Conversely, hyperthyroidism creates a state of manic anxiety, heart palpitations, and insomnia that can be indistinguishable from an anxiety disorder. This proves that mental illness is often a systemic body illness. The impact of sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone on the brain is massive and cyclical. Estrogen is neuroprotective. It supports the growth of neurons and boosts serotonin. The precipitous drop in estrogen during perimenopause or postpartum periods can trigger catastrophic mental health declines in susceptible women. Postpartum psychosis, a rare but medical emergency, reveals how a sudden hormonal shift can completely detach a person from reality. Similarly, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMDD, is not just PMS, it is a severe genetic sensitivity to the fluctuation of progesterone, causing the brain to enter a state of deep depression or rage for a week every month. In men, low testosterone levels are strongly linked to irritable depression, fatigue, and a loss of cognitive sharpness.
A frontier of modern research is the gut-brain axis, which has revolutionized our understanding of chemical imbalance. We now know that 90% of the body's serotonin is produced not in the brain, but in the gut by the microbiome. The vagus nerve serves as a superhighway connecting the intestines to the brainstem. Dysbiosis, an imbalance of gut bacteria caused by poor diet or antibiotics, can lead to the production of inflammatory cytokines and neurotoxic metabolites that travel up the vagus nerve and inflame the brain. This suggests that for many, the chemical imbalance starts in the stomach. The saying gut feeling is a biological reality. A distressed gut creates a distressed mind. We must also explore the concept of neurotrophic factors, specifically BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Think of BDNF as Miracle-Gro for the brain. It encourages the growth of new neurons and synapses, neuroplasticity. Chronic stress and depression suppress the gene that creates BDNF. The hippocampus, the memory center, physically shrinks. The modern understanding of antidepressants is that they don't just boost serotonin, they eventually increase BDNF, allowing the brain to heal and rewire itself. This takes weeks, which explains the lag time in treatment. The mental disorder is in this view a failure of plasticity. The brain becomes rigid, stuck in a negative groove, unable to grow new pathways out of the darkness. The complexity of this chemical machinery explains why treatment is so difficult. It is not as simple as topping up the oil. The brain employs homeostatic mechanisms. If you flood it with serotonin artificially, it may downregulate receptors to maintain the status quo, leading to poop-out effects, where drugs stop working. Furthermore, individual genetic variations, pharmacogenomics, mean that one person's cure is another person's poison. A liver enzyme variation might cause a patient to metabolize a drug too fast, no effect, or too slow, toxicity. We are also seeing a resurgence in the study of psychedelics, psilocybin, ketamine, which operate on entirely different chemical mechanisms. Ketamine, for instance, blocks NMDA glutamate receptors, providing rapid relief from suicidal depression by essentially rebooting the synaptic connections. This challenges the decades-old dominance of the serotonin theory and opens new doors into understanding the glutamine-driven architecture of mood. Finally,
we must acknowledge the philosophical implication of chemical determinism. If our moods, our fears, and our very personalities are dictated by the concentration of molecules in a synaptic gap, what does that say about free will? The person suffering from a hormonal imbalance feels their rage or sadness is real and justified by the world around them. It is terrifying to realize that the reality of the world can be darkened simply by the fluctuation of a thyroid hormone or a drop in dopamine. The chemical imbalance doesn't just change how we feel, it changes who we are. In summary, the chemical and hormonal drivers of mental disorders are a testament to the fragility of the human condition. We are walking chemistry sets, reliant on a precise titration of biological fluids to maintain our sanity. When that balance tips, whether due to genetics, environment, or disease, the mind is cast adrift. It is not a character flaw, it is a mechanical failure in the most complex machine in the universe, a glitch in the biological matrix that constructs our consciousness.
9. Chronic illness and long-term pain, the prison of the body. The investigation into the roots of mental disorder inevitably leads us to the most visceral and inescapable boundary of human existence, the physical body. For centuries, Western medicine was held captive by Cartesian dualism, the philosophical doctrine of the 17th century that viewed the mind and body as distinct, separate entities. The body was a machine, and the mind was a ghost in the machine. If the machine broke, it was a mechanical problem. If the ghost wailed, it was a spiritual or psychiatric one. Modern science has violently dismantled this separation. We now understand that chronic illness and long-term pain are not merely physical afflictions that make a person sad about their condition. They are systemic, biological assaults on the neural architecture of the brain itself. To live with chronic disease is to inhabit a nervous system under siege, where the biochemistry of sickness actively manufactures the biochemistry of madness. We must first analyze the phenomenon of chronic pain, a condition that affects over 20% of the global population. Pain is meant to be a transient alarm signal, a sharp, immediate warning of tissue damage. However, when pain persists for months or years, it ceases to be a symptom and becomes a disease in itself. This transformation is driven by a neurological process called central sensitization. In this state, the central nervous system undergoes a maladaptive neuroplastic change. The neurons in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord become hypersensitive, and the brain's pain matrix, including the thalamus and the somatosensory cortex, rewires itself to amplify incoming signals. The volume knob is turned up and broken off. The tragedy is that this rewiring physically overlaps with the brain's emotional centers. The anterior cingulate cortex, responsible for processing the emotional unpleasantness of pain, is also a key regulator of mood. As the brain dedicates more real estate to processing pain, it steals resources from emotional regulation. The pain and the depression become fused into a singular agonizing neurological event. The patient is not just hurting, they are trapped in a feedback loop where physical agony depletes the serotonin and norepinephrine needed to inhibit pain, which in turn leads to more pain and deeper depression. This biological siege is further elucidated by the cytokine theory of depression.
When the body fights a chronic illness, be it an autoimmune disorder like rheumatoid arthritis, a metabolic condition like diabetes, or a persistent viral infection, the immune system is in a state of constant activation. It releases pro-inflammatory cytokines, such as interleukin-6, IL-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF-alpha. These proteins do not stay in the body, they cross the blood-brain barrier. Once inside the brain, they act as neurotoxins. They disrupt the synthesis of neurotransmitters, effectively siphoning off the raw materials needed to make serotonin and converting them into quinolinic acid, a compound that causes anxiety and neurotoxicity. Evolutionarily, this is known as sickness behavior. When a caveman was sick, the body forced him to withdraw, sleep, and lose interest in the world to conserve energy for healing. In the modern context of chronic illness, this mechanism never shuts off. The patient is trapped in a permanent biologically induced state of withdrawal and lethargy that clinical psychiatry diagnoses as major depressive disorder. The depression is not a reaction to the illness, it is a symptom of the inflammation itself. The psychological toll of chronic illness is equally devastating, rooted in the erosion of the self. A healthy individual moves through the world with a sense of somatic silence. The body is a quiet vessel that obeys the will. For the chronically ill, the body becomes a loud, rebellious tyrant. This loss of autonomy triggers a profound existential crisis. The concept of learned helplessness developed by Martin Seligman becomes the daily reality. When an individual realizes that no amount of effort, pleading, or medication fully resolves their suffering, the agency of the mind collapses. This is the breeding ground for despair. The future, once a landscape of possibility, shrinks to the immediate management of symptoms. This foreshortened future creates a specific type of anxiety, a claustrophobic dread of the passing of time, where the patient sees only a trajectory of decline. The identity shifts from I am a lawyer to I am a mother to I am a patient. This engulfment by the sick role strips away the pillars of self-esteem and social connection, leaving the individual isolated in a private universe of suffering that healthy people can observe but never truly enter. We must also confront the specific psychiatric sequelae of autoimmune diseases. Conditions like lupus,
Multiple sclerosis, or MS, and Hashimoto's thyroiditis are notorious for their neuropsychiatric presentations. In MS, the immune system attacks the myelin sheath of the nerves. When this demyelination occurs in the brain, it can cause rapid, unpredictable mood swings, pathological laughing or crying, pseudobulbar affect, and cognitive decline. In lupus, antibodies can directly attack the brain tissue, CNS lupus, causing psychosis, paranoia, and severe cognitive fog. These are not mental illnesses in the traditional sense. They are biological illnesses manifesting in the theater of the mind. The tragedy is that many of these patients are initially misdiagnosed as bipolar or schizophrenic and placed on psychiatric drugs that do nothing to treat the underlying immune assault. It highlights the dangerous siloization of medicine, where the rheumatologist looks at the joints, the neurologist looks at the nerves, and the psychiatrist looks at the mood, with no one seeing the whole person. The relationship between diabetes and mental health offers another grim case study in this physiological interplay. We call this diabetes distress, but the link is deeper. The fluctuating blood glucose levels in a diabetic patient act as a chaotic weather system for the brain. Hyperglycemia, high blood sugar, is neurotoxic, causing inflammation and oxidative stress that damages the hippocampus, the memory center. Hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, triggers a massive release of adrenaline and cortisol, mimicking a panic attack. Over time, the diabetic brain is subjected to a chemical roller coaster that wears down the emotional resilience. Furthermore, the sheer cognitive load of managing a chronic illness, the constant monitoring, the medication schedules, the dietary restrictions, creates a state of decision fatigue and burnout that is clinically indistinguishable from generalized anxiety disorder. We must also address the iatrogenic, doctor-caused, damage associated with treating chronic pain, specifically the opioid crisis. For decades, the medical establishment attempted to treat chronic pain with opioids, drugs designed for acute, short-term pain. While these drugs numb the physical sensation, they also numb the emotional landscape, causing opioid-induced dysphoria. Long-term use rewires the brain's reward system, creating a state where the patient cannot feel joy without the drug, anhedonia. When the medical system restricts these drugs,
the patient is plunged into a withdrawal that is not just physical but psychological, a terror and depression so absolute it drives suicide rates among chronic pain patients to horrifying heights. The intersection of pain management and addiction is perhaps the deadliest frontier in modern mental health. The cultural phenomenon of the spoon theory, originating in the chronic illness community, provides a vital metaphor for understanding this mental exhaustion. It posits that a sick person has a finite number of spoons, units of energy, per day. A shower costs a spoon. A difficult conversation costs two. This constant high-stakes economic calculation of energy creates a background radiation of anxiety. If I go to this lunch, will I be able to work tomorrow? This hypervigilance prevents the nervous system from ever entering a state of rest. The chronic illness patient is always working, always calculating, always managing. managing. Finally, we must look at the impact of medical gaslighting on mental health. Many chronic illnesses, particularly those affecting women like endometriosis, fibromyalgia, and ME/CFS, are invisible and poorly understood. Patients often spend years being told their symptoms are all in their head or just stress. This systematic invalidation is a form of psychological trauma. It causes the patient to doubt their own sanity, leading to deep insecurity and resentment toward the caregiving systems meant to protect them. The struggle for a diagnosis becomes a war, and by the time the diagnosis comes, the patient is often suffering from complex PTSD caused by the medical system itself. In conclusion, chronic illness is a state of biological and existential entrapment. It demonstrates that the mind is not a floating entity, it is tethered to the flesh. When the flesh fails, the mind is dragged down with it. The inflammation, the pain signaling, and the hormonal chaos of the sick body create a hostile environment for the psyche. Treating the mental disorder without addressing the physical reality is like trying to bail water out of a sinking ship with plugging the hole. The future of psychiatry lies in psychoneuroimmunology, the integrated treatment of the mind, the nervous system, and the immune system as one unified defense mechanism.
10. Unhealthy lifestyle, poor diet, no exercise, the slow poisoning of the modern mind. As we reach the final entry in our investigation, we confront a cause of mental disorder that is entirely self-inflicted yet systemically engineered: the modern lifestyle. We are living in an environment that is fundamentally mismatched with our evolutionary biology. The human genome was forged in the Paleolithic era, a time of scarcity, constant movement, and nutrient-dense whole foods. Today, we inhabit a world of sedentary abundance, hyper-palatable processed substances, and artificial ease. This mismatch has created a mismatched disease epidemic. We often view poor diet and lack of exercise as contributors to obesity or heart disease, but the most immediate and devastating target is the brain. The modern lifestyle is not just making us fat, it is making us crazy. This is the dawn of metabolic psychiatry, a field that posits that mental disorders are at their core metabolic disorders of the brain, caused by environmental toxicity. We must start with the most significant discovery in biological psychiatry of the 21st century, the gut-brain axis. For decades, the gut was viewed merely as a fuel tank. We now know it is the second brain. The enteric nervous system lining the gastrointestinal tract contains over 500 million neurons and produces 95% of the body's serotonin and 50% of its dopamine. This system is in constant bidirectional communication with the brain via the vagus nerve. The health of this communication depends entirely on the microbiome, the trillions of bacteria residing in our colon. An unhealthy diet high in sugar, processed fats, and low in fiber starves the beneficial bacteria like Lactobacillus and Bifidobacterium and feeds the pathogenic ones. This state, known as dysbiosis, is cataclysmic for mental health. The bad bacteria release lipopolysaccharides, toxins, that degrade the gut lining, leaky gut syndrome. These toxins leak into the bloodstream, triggering systemic inflammation that travels to the brain, shutting down dopamine production and inducing anxiety and depression. We are literally feeding the depression. The specific villain in this narrative is sugar, and broadly the ultra-processed Western diet. Sugar acts on the brain as a drug, lighting up the nucleus accumbens with the same intensity as cocaine. Over time, the brain downregulates its dopamine receptors to handle the constant sugar rush,
leading to a reward deficiency state where normal life feels gray and uninteresting, but the damage goes deeper. High sugar intake leads to insulin resistance, not just in the body, but in the brain. Insulin is crucial for neuronal growth and maintenance. When brain cells become insulin resistant, they cannot absorb glucose efficiently. They essentially starve to death amidst a sea of plenty. This metabolic dysfunction is now being linked so strongly to cognitive decline that Alzheimer's disease is frequently referred to as type 3 diabetes. But long before dementia sets in, this cerebral energy crisis manifests as brain fog, irritability, mood swings, and major depression. The brain lacks the metabolic energy to regulate emotion. Furthermore, the modern diet is defined by critical micronutrient deficiencies that mimic psychiatric disorders. The brain is a high-performance engine requiring specific lubricants: omega-3 fatty acids, magnesium, vitamin B12, zinc, and vitamin D. The Western diet is woefully deficient in these. Omega-3s found in fatty fish are essential for building the cell membranes of neurons. Without them, the membranes become rigid and neurotransmitter signaling slows down. Studies have shown that nations with higher fish consumption have drastically lower rates of bipolar disorder and depression. Magnesium deficiency, common in 80% of the population due to soil depletion and processed food, leads to hyperexcitability of the nervous system, a direct cause of anxiety and insomnia. We are attempting to run a complex biological machine without the necessary spare parts, and we are surprised when it breaks down. The second pillar of this lifestyle collapse is the sedentary life. We have engineered movement out of our existence. We sit in cars, sit at desks, and sit on couches. This is not a neutral state, it is a pathogenic one. The human brain evolved in motion.
For our ancestors, movement was linked to survival, hunting, foraging, escaping. Therefore, the brain is wired to release its most potent neurochemicals during physical exertion. When we stop moving, we turn off the tap of the brain's natural antidepressants. The mechanism of exercise on mental health centers on a protein called BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor. BDNF is often described as Miracle-Gro for the brain. It stimulates neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons, and protects existing ones from stress.
High-intensity exercise is the single most potent natural trigger for BDNF release. In a sedentary individual, BDNF levels plummet. The hippocampus, the region responsible for memory and emotional context, begins to atrophy. This shrinkage is a hallmark of depression. Conversely, regular exercise has been shown in clinical trials to be as effective as SSRI antidepressants for mild to moderate depression, without the side effects. It works by physically rebuilding the brain infrastructure that stress destroys. Moreover, skeletal muscle is now understood to be an endocrine organ. When muscles contract, they release myokines, chemical messengers that enter the bloodstream and cross the blood-brain barrier. These myokines have powerful anti-inflammatory effects and help regulate mood. By not using our muscles, we are depriving the brain of these healing signals. We also fail to burn off the stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, that accumulate during the day. In a sedentary body, the stress response is triggered by an angry email or a traffic jam, but the physical release, the fight or flight, never happens. The stress hormones stew in the system, corroding the neural tissue and keeping the body in a state of chronic anxiety. We must also consider the role of inflammaging. The combination of a pro-inflammatory diet, high in omega-6 vegetable oils and sugar, and a sedentary lifestyle creates a state of chronic, low-grade inflammation throughout the body. As discussed in entry number 9, inflammation is a direct cause of depression. The modern lifestyle is essentially an inflammatory lifestyle. We are keeping our immune systems on high alert, fighting a war against the food we eat and the stagnation of our own bodies. This constant immune activity drains the brain of energy and motivation. The cultural context of this lifestyle is a tragic narrative of convenience over health. We are surrounded by food deserts where fresh produce is scarce and obesogenic environments that discourage walking. The food industry has scientifically engineered products to hit the bliss point of salt, sugar, and fat, bypassing the brain's satiety signals and hijacking the addiction circuitry. This is not a failure of willpower, it is a biological mismatch. The brain is fighting a losing battle against an environment designed to exploit its evolutionary cravings.
This leads to the cycle of emotional eating, using food to soothe the very anxiety that the food itself is helping to create. Furthermore, the lack of sun exposure, a consequence of the indoor lifestyle, leads to widespread vitamin D deficiency. Vitamin D is actually a neurosteroid hormone that regulates over 1,000 genes, including those for tyrosine hydroxylase, the enzyme needed to make dopamine and norepinephrine. Low vitamin D is strongly correlated with seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, and general depression. We have become cave dwellers in cubicles, disconnected from the solar cycles that regulate our circadian rhythms and mood. The future of mental health treatment may well lie in the grocery store and the gym rather than the pharmacy. The field of nutritional psychiatry is rapidly gaining ground, with protocols like the ketogenic diet being used to treat bipolar disorder and schizophrenia by changing the brain's fuel source from glucose to ketones, bypassing the insulin resistance and stabilizing neuronal energy. Exercise prescriptions are becoming a reality in forward-thinking medical systems. We are realizing that you cannot medicate your way out of a bad lifestyle. In the final analysis, the unhealthy lifestyle is the great silent amplifier of all other mental health risks. It weakens the genetic resilience, entry number 1, exacerbates the inflammation of stress, entry number 2, and destroys the sleep architecture, entry number 6. It is the muddy soil in which the seeds of mental disorder take root. By reclaiming our biology, by feeding the microbiome, moving the body, and respecting our evolutionary needs, we offer the brain its best chance at defense. The cure for the modern mind may very well be a return to the ancient body.